Hello and welcome to yet another edition of Ebenezer Reformed Church's online Sunday School. Today we reach the 12th installment in our Epistolary Examples series, where we're considering what we can learn from the New Testament letters when we take their authors as examples. And of course we've narrowed that down a little bit so that what we've looked at primarily is what we can learn from the New Testament authors of the letters specifically when we consider them as examples of communication. And so in Romans we've seen Paul approaching Christians that he doesn't necessarily know personally. In 1 Corinthians we've seen him communicating with Christians where there are problems, and in 2 Corinthians we've seen him communicating with Christians where there are conflicts. And apart from a little interruption with regard to the question of fundraising, which Paul also does in 2 Corinthians, we've spent most of our time over these 12 lessons looking at what we can find out from Paul about how to communicate with Christians with whom one happens to be in conflict. And obviously there are always going to be individual specifics that aren't necessarily easy to relate to our own situations. The unique profile that Paul and the Corinthians and the whole situation had will certainly make an impact. But hopefully, as we've worked through this, we've been able to see that there's a lot to take away. Well then, in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, which is where we've gotten to today, Paul now pulls back the curtain, so to speak, to a considerable degree on what is the situation that he is in fact facing. What is the source of the conflict between him and the Corinthians? And as always, there's going to be multiple factors. One factor, of course, is the reality that Paul wrote them 1 Corinthians, trying to set them straight. Another factor is that in 1 Corinthians he promised to come visit them, but then he postponed, he deferred that visit, not because he didn't love them, not because he wasn't concerned for them, not because his word meant nothing, but because he thought maybe some additional time, maybe some additional forbearance would be useful in helping them to return to the frame of mind that he wanted them to be in. But as often happens when there are those whose desire is to stir up conflict, and this happens wherever Satan can get a foothold, of course, people would take advantage of that. And so Paul had been misrepresented to the Corinthians as somebody who was personally contemptible, as someone who was untrustworthy and unreliable. And as we find out in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul was misrepresented to them as somebody whose credentials were shaky and whose concern for the Thessalonians was, to say the least, somewhat suspect. So in 2 Corinthians 11, Paul is most specifically addressing the sources of the conflict. He's talked about some of the other things before, but here he's coming to identify who are these teachers, who are these other people who are influencing the Corinthians against him. And he doesn't really pull any punches. Such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for Satan himself transforms himself into an angel of light. Therefore it is no great thing if his ministers also transform themselves into ministers of righteousness, whose end will be according to their works. That's verses 13 through 15 of 2 Corinthians 11. Now, Paul would not say that about everybody who had conflicts or disagreements with him. Paul was not of the mindset that disagreeing with him automatically meant that somebody was a false apostle. Specifically in this case, he wants to cut off opportunity to take that option off the table from those who desire to be regarded just as we are in the things of which they boast, according to verse 12. In other words, here are people claiming a position they don't have, they haven't been given, and an influence that they don't deserve. So how does Paul approach that issue? Here you have Christians who are very dear to him, who came to know the gospel through his ministry, but whose affections have been alienated from him, in part because of their own vulnerability due to sinful choices that they'd made, but in no small measure also due to the influence of these other people. Well, Paul favors a direct approach. Now, that's not to say that he wasn't patient. That's not to say that he wasn't strategic. As we've already been reminded, he did wait and not visit Corinth in person in order to give more time. He's trying to resolve things by letters if he can, so that when he visits, it can be joyful and amicable. But in his letter, he takes a direct approach. 2 Corinthians 11, verse 1, "Oh, that you would bear with me in a little folly." And indeed, you do bear with me. In other words, he's basically saying, okay, indulge me. I'm going to say things I wouldn't ordinarily say. I'm going to present myself in a way that may be unfamiliar to you. Please understand that this is due to the context. Understand that this is due to what I'm being forced to do in light of the circumstances. And there is a very valuable observation in that for all of us, and that is that when we are in controversy, we sometimes have to do things that don't come naturally and that we don't necessarily enjoy. In other words, the task of standing for the truth, the task of opposing what is wrong, the task even of clearing our own names or clearing up misunderstandings, those are not necessarily, not most of the time, enjoyable things to be involved in. You go into it under a little bit of stress and pressure. Your normal demeanor may be somewhat affected, somewhat changed by that. And very often, of course, in those high-pressure situations, you see that somebody's demeanor is different. Maybe they're more nervous, maybe they're more vocal, maybe their words are not as carefully chosen, or whatever it might be. And it's easy, of course, since we're also in a high-pressure situation, to make the worst of that, to attribute nervousness to, oh, they're not confident in their own position, or, well, I don't know if I can believe that, because did you see? I'm not saying that none of those things ever happen, but I think in controversy we should be particularly forbearing. If somebody uses the wrong word, if somebody's demeanor seems weird, if somebody is awkward around us, don't know how to greet us, have trouble smiling, all that kind of thing, be forbearing about that. Let that go. That's not a big deal. If you can actually communicate and clear the air, then all of those constraints, all of those pressures that are arising from the fact that it is a sticky and a difficult situation will probably largely go away by themselves. They don't need to be a big thing unless we make them a big thing by attributing too much importance to them. But, if the other person is nervous or on edge or whatever, odds are we probably come across that way a little bit too. It's just people have different coping strategies for that. Some people get louder and more boisterous, whereas other people shut down a little bit and are very quiet and reserved. It's very likely the same nervousness underlying a lot of it, and so that kind of variation doesn't need to be a big deal. So Paul acknowledges that there's a certain amount of folly in what he's doing here. And when he does that, I'm inevitably reminded of Proverbs, which tells us not to answer a fool according to his folly, lest we become like him. But it also says that we should answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceit. There are things that we would rather not do that don't seem like the most convenient or the best choice, but sometimes we don't have a choice because there's no other way to tackle a particular situation. So Paul takes the direct approach. He asks for forbearance. Second, he reminds them of his motivations. I am jealous of you with godly jealousy, for I have betrothed you to one husband, that I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ. But I fear lest somehow, as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, so your minds may be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ. For if he who comes preaches another Jesus whom we have not preached, or if you receive a different spirit which you have not received, or a different gospel which you have not accepted, you may well put up with it." So he explains the source of his anxiety about them. He wants them to be faithful to Christ. That's his goal. That's been his goal all along. And they're in danger of having their minds corrupted away from the simplicity that is in Christ. And the reason he thinks that is the reception that they've given to other people who are coming. Well, you might think back to 1 Corinthians and remember that in chapter 15, Paul has to address the reality that resurrection is a basic Christian doctrine. And yet there were some, whether from the Corinthians themselves or people who had come to visit them, who seemed to think that although Christ had risen, Christians would not be raised from the dead. That's a very serious doctrinal error. That overthrows the faith. And so Paul is not exaggerating. Paul is not lightly jumping to this conclusion. He's recognizing that the Corinthians are in danger. So he asks for forbearance. He tells them his motivations, and he reminds them that they're in danger. Now, from that, then, he gets to the defense of himself. What had these false teachers who had come among the Corinthians been saying? Well, they'd been saying that Paul wasn't really much of an apostle. After all, he didn't belong to the original 12. Of course, it kind of goes without saying that neither did any of these false teachers who had come among the Corinthians, but that fact was conveniently overlooked. So Paul has to defend his apostleship now. And he says, 2 Corinthians 11, verse 5, "For I consider that I am not at all inferior to the most eminent apostles. Even though I am untrained in speech, yet I am not in knowledge. But we have been thoroughly manifested among you in all things." Now he's going to come back to this question of his relative ranking with the other apostles. And in the nature of the case, this is not something Paul would ever have chosen to talk about. It was forced upon him by allegations that were made against him. He didn't want to compare himself with other apostles. We were seeing last week that that sort of comparison is foolish. But if people are going to say, well, you don't have to take Paul's preaching all that seriously because he's not an original apostle, well, at that point, it's undermining his ministry, and he has to say something about it. So that was one charge. Paul is not really an entire apostle. He's not an original apostle. He's a knockoff version. But then we also find there was another source of accusation against him, and one that's very odd. Verse 7, "Did I commit sin in humbling myself that you might be exalted, because I preached the gospel of God to you free of charge? I robbed other churches, taking wages from them to minister to you. And when I was present with you and in need, I was a burden to no one. For what I lacked, the brethren who came from Macedonia supplied. And in everything I kept myself from being burdensome to you, and so I will keep myself. As the truth of Christ is in me, no one shall stop me from this boasting in the regions of Achaia. Why? Because I do not love you? God knows." Now, there's two accusations that seem to be mixed up or bundled together in that paragraph. One accusation, one club that was being used to hit Paul with, is that he didn't accept financial support from the church in Corinth and the other churches in that same region of Achaia. Now, Paul had accepted and did accept support from other churches. In Romans, we find out that he wants the Romans to financially help him with his proposed missionary voyage to Spain. In Philippians, we find out that they sent money for his support on multiple occasions. Paul teaches in the pastoral epistles that the laborer is worthy of his hire. But there was some special circumstance that made him resolve in Achaia not to take money from those churches, at least not to take money from those churches while he was working among them. I think the most likely explanation for why that would be is that there were a lot of traveling philosophers who made their living lecturing, tutoring, taking students, or whatever, and many of them really didn't have anything very important to offer. Well, Paul didn't want to be lumped in with this other category of people. He didn't want people to think that he taught, that he preached, that he did what he did for the money. And so in order to open a door for Christian ministry, in order to remove barriers from people hearing the gospel, he would not take money from the churches in that region. Now, you think about the wonderful irony here. Paul makes this self-sacrificing decision not to take money from churches in this part of the world. He understands that as people hear the gospel, as they believe, as they are brought into the church and are discipled, that one of their desires will be to contribute financially for the support of the ministry. But they're not going to be allowed to contribute to him, at least not while he's among them. That was probably not an easy decision to make. It certainly added a layer of complication to Paul's life. When he was present with them and in need, he did not become a burden to anyone. But that tells you that he went through some belt-tightening times because of this resolution. So keep all of that in mind, and then realize that Paul is defending himself for having made the decision not to take money from them in order to remove barriers to the spread of the gospel. This is one of those situations where you can well imagine that if the false teachers had come among the Corinthians and had found that Paul had taken money from them, then he would have been accused of greediness, right? He would have been accused of being grasping. He would have been accused of being in it for the money. Well, he didn't take money from them, so what were the false teachers going to accuse him of? Well, they find a way. They insinuate that must mean that Paul didn't really trust the Corinthians, that he didn't love them, he didn't care about them because he didn't allow them to share financially in his ministry. Well, Paul has to appeal to the Lord. The Lord knows the heart. Did he do that because he did not love them? God knows the answer to that. God knows that he did love them. God knows that Paul made that particular judgment call, which is not valid for all times and all places, but seemed suitable given the overall cultural situation. Paul made that judgment call because he loved the Corinthians, because he didn't want to put anything in the way of them believing the gospel. That got turned into a club to beat him with. When we're in controversy and conflict, it's not to be expected that all blows will be above the belt. Now, that does not in any way give us a pass to engage in low blows, to fight dirty, but it does mean that a certain amount of that can be expected. You have to be ready to face that. It also teaches us the principle that sometimes what we do in an attempt to be loving towards others, that's genuinely motivated by a zeal for God's glory and affection for other people, even that can be misinterpreted. It can be used against us. I'm not saying that's right. I'm not saying that's appropriate. And certainly if you read this passage, you hear what I'm saying, and you think, oh yeah, I've done that. I'm not saying that's good. Please don't do that again. But it is a thing that often happens in controversy. Paul has to defend himself for having loved the Corinthians. Paul has to defend himself for not taking money from them. There are times when it doesn't really make that much difference what you do. If there's a warm enough controversy, you're going to be dinged for something. You could have had the best motives in the world. It doesn't get you off the hook from experiencing a certain amount of criticism. Well, even as this series continues to spiral out of control, we again fail to make it all the way through even one chapter of 2 Corinthians in one of our sessions. So we'll have to return to 2 Corinthians chapter 11 next time. Until then, may the Lord bless you.